Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 19th of September. My name is Maggie Lennon and I'll start the programme with the most up-to-date coronavirus statistics for Scotland. As of 2 o'clock yesterday, 6,116 new confirmed cases of COVID were registered and there were 27 new deaths. 4,151,735 people in Scotland have received their first dose of the vaccine and 3,802,183 the second. There were 1,052 people in hospital last night, 99 of whom were in intensive care. 529,207 people in Scotland have tested positive since the pandemic began, and sadly, since the start of the pandemic, 8,376 people have died. I'm joined today by Western Bartonshire MP Martin Docherty-Hughes and Perth and Kinross Councillor Sheila McCole, who represents the Perth City South ward. Good afternoon to you both. Going to start with a big international story that's been breaking this week, and this is the creation of AUKUS. So for anyone who thinks that's some kind of weird bird, it's not. It's the new defence pact that's been signed or is in the process of being developed between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom. And this is to make sure that Australia can have the technology to produce nuclear-powered submarines. This is not saying that Australia is going to be a nuclear power. The submarines will not be weaponised. But this pact is supposedly being set up in order to monitor what's happening in the South China Sea, and in particular is seen as a bit of a check on what China are doing. Now, it's caused a bit of a furore, not least in France, who are about to sign a submarine deal with Australia. And for the first time in sort of modern history, the French have now pulled out their embassy staff and diplomats from both the United States and Australia over this debacle because they feel that they've been betrayed. Apparently, they didn't hear about it till late in the day. New Zealand didn't hear about it until it was announced on the TV. So, what really is behind this pact, do you think? And I'll start with you, Martin. Is this just the United Kingdom government attempting to flex its muscles one last time and show that it's got some international influence, or is there something else going on here?
To me, I think, Maggie, the simple answer to that is yes. They're trying to make themselves relevant in the Indo-Pacific region. And, when they're sending an aircraft carrier out there, when they really should be concentrating on the North Atlantic. I mean, I'm well known for hating acronyms, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it's in the name, it's about the North Atlantic. And in many ways, I think what they're doing here is they're trying to show themselves relevant to the big players in the Indo-Pacific, and that will be both the United States and, of course, China.
Sheila, the Australian Prime Minister referred to it as a forever partnership. Now, most partnerships don't last forever, so that's fairly optimistic. I'm wondering, are you aware of how this is playing in Australia? Because we're not seeing anything on the news here about how it's going down over there.
Well, in Australia, they think it's a fantastic deal, actually. The deal they signed with France, actually, in 2016 was with a view to replacing their entire fleet by 2026. But right from the offset, it was beset by delays of design, which pushed out the cost and pushed out the timelines. And I believe the most recent projection from the French deal was that the last sub would only be delivered in 2054. So this deal is seen as a huge win for Australia. They think it's fantastic altogether. There's been lots of complaints about the French deal for the past 3 years in the Australian press, at least. And it was signed by a previous government, not the current one in Australia. So I think altogether, the Australians are perfectly happy with it. The subs will still be built in Adelaide, which is what the original deal was. And I think we have to remember that there's been quite a lot of, Australia feel quite threatened by China generally, and they see maritime defence as a key aspect of their national security issues. And the other thing that's alarmed them particularly is that China have signed a new deal with Papua New Guinea to build a deep water port there. And Papua New Guinea is just basically a stone's throw, a hop and a skip from Australia. And Australia are concerned that China will use that not just for their fishing fleet, which means that they would encroach into fishing waters around Australia, but also that potentially it has wider military implications, having a deep water port so close to them. So for Australia, they see this as absolutely a great deal altogether.
Okay, so I know that you're saying that they've always been worried about China, but also they have massive trade links with China. I think it's their main trading partner. And there's been a lot of reports recently about how Chinese influence in Australia is becoming quite endemic in all sorts of areas. So when Australian students have been protesting, for example, or were protesting over the issues around China's influence in Hong Kong and the crackdown in Hong Kong, as non-Chinese students who were demonstrating were being castigated by their universities. They were being dismissed from classes in some cases. And there was a suggestion that's because quite a lot of universities in Australia actually have quite high-ranking Chinese diplomats on their and consulars on their sort of boards. So there seems to be this massive link. I think Australia per head of population has got the largest percentage of Chinese students studying in the country. So, Martin, do you not think, although they might be pleased in some respects, this is going to damage trade links with China?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really strange one for me. China's also just applied to join the Asia Pacific Trade Pact, which of course includes Australia, and Australia's, as you were saying, Maggie, its biggest trading partner is communist China, and it's a very kind of weird position to then create a defense agreement trying to defend yourself against your biggest trading partner. So I find that all a bit odd. There is also, I think, that over-reliance. You can't blame the Chinese for that. That's Australia's fault for being overly reliant on, for example, foreign students to support their education system. You can't blame the young Chinese people who are going there, who are supporting Australia's position. And just on the matter of the submarines themselves, I mean, what we find here is that this original discussion in Australia goes way back to the premiership of Bob Hawke, and I'm old enough to remember Bob Hawke as premier, and here we are again signing a new deal with the Americans and the British, and they're still not going to have submarines for another 2 decades. So if there's anyone laughing today, it's going to be China, because they're just saying this is just absolutely ridiculous. It's saber rattling, but at the end of the day, Australia won't have these nuclear-powered submarines for at least another 2 decades.
I'm just wondering, Sheila, if Australia's going to get these submarines eventually, and they'll have to have the facilities for them, I wonder, is that where we should be sending Trident when Scotland gets rid of it? Because there's been a lot of discussion recently about what would happen to Trident, and there was a suggestion it could go to a foreign power. France was suggested, well, that's not going to happen now because the French knows as well out of joint. Maybe it's Australia.
Well, I must admit that was my first thought. That would be a home for Trident. And it's not without the realms of possibility that is somewhere at the back of Boris Johnson's mind, although he would never concede that point. The thing about the trade with Australia, though, if I can come back to that, is that ever since Australia suggested that COVID emanated from China or a Chinese lab, there has been quite a number of trade constraints on Chinese exports, which has hit some sectors of the economy particularly hard. And in fact, at one time they banned all imports of coal, but people were literally freezing in China, so they had to relent on that one. But there's still a lot of goods that normally would have exported to China that just haven't been going, which now we'll get as part of the UK-Australia trade deal. Who knows?
Far be it from me to willingly quote Theresa May, but she has come out quite strongly and asked specific questions of the UK government that by signing this deal, is there any possibility that this might draw the UK into a conflict situation, especially around Taiwan? So as we know, Martin, China don't regard Taiwan as an independent state, and they are flexing their muscles again. And surely this kind of deal would make it more likely, would it not, that we, Britain and Australia, would have to get involved in a conflict situation. Now, we've just come out of a conflict situation by signing up to be America's best pal. Didn't end well. So this seems a bizarre sort of foreign policy idea, don't you think?
Do you know, I'm loath to agree with Theresa May, but there is I think a reality that both Communist China and the United States certainly don't want conflict in the Pacific region. China does have some kind of bizarre territorial claims in creating huge archipelagos to extend Chinese territory in the Indo-Pacific region. there certainly are concerns, but I think, to be realistic, I don't see military conflict in that area happening for a range of reasons. We're talking about a vast swathe of the human population living in that part of the world, in the Pacific Rim, and it would just be a dreadful impact on the world economy and the societies that live in that part of the world. In any sense, in some senses, it just doesn't make sense. But there seems to be a rationale that the Americans are trying to do a bit of pushback. There is a theory called mutually assured restraint, which is probably a more positive approach to China. Having mutual agreements about what's possible, and also limiting an arms race in that region. That's, for me, the biggest concern is extending the arms race and giving China the opt-out to further enhance its own capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, because that's all it'll do. They will say to themselves, well, if you're doing it, we can keep going on with it.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like the let's return to domestic policy agenda that Biden was spouting after the withdrawal from Afghanistan slightly. Sheila, do you think this is a very deliberate attempt by Boris Johnson and the UK government to say we are prepared to turn our back on our European neighbours? So we've upset the French by this. So I guess Boris Johnson thinks that's a bonus. But it feels, again, that this is us looking to America and our Commonwealth allies and saying, Europe, we're done with you. Or is that too broad a suggestion?
I think it's possibly too broad a suggestion for a couple of reasons. One is that Boris Johnson has been very clear that his post-Brexit strategy sees more influence in the Pacific Rim area, primarily for trade. I think the other thing we do need to recall is that the UK and Australia and the USA, along with New Zealand and Canada, are all part of the Five Eyes security grouping. So they already have some strategic discussions ongoing. I suspect this is more to do with America, and that the UK are going along with it. Boris Johnson's due to go to America next week, I believe, and that he's still very keen to develop closer trade links with America, which so far seem to be not forthcoming. So I think there's probably it's really been driven by America as opposed to by the UK, I believe.
We might see more of this kind of flexing of muscles and more weird alliances in the coming years, but we'll keep an eye on this and see if it develops anyway. Sheila, you mentioned COVID when we were talking about the relationships between China and Australia. And obviously the big news for COVID, apart from the increasing numbers, is the change to the travel restrictions. So there's no more amber list, it's been merged with the green list. It's all been much more simple. But in Scotland, we're sticking with the testing that is required when you're travelling abroad. There seems to be a human right, a sense that going on holiday and lying on a beach is a human right, and that everybody's got to be allowed to do that. Really, should we be making these concessions this early, or should we be at least waiting until we get through the winter with all the pressures that are coming onto the NHS across the UK? And is the Scottish Government right in keeping the testing regime in place while the rest of the UK abandon it? Sheila.
Is that for me?
Yes.
Thank you. I think that Scotland has a couple of considerations it needs to make, and not least of which is COP26 next month in Glasgow, where there will be a large number of international travellers coming in. So I think that has to play some part in their thinking. I'm not sure yet whether or not Wales and Northern Ireland have agreed to suspend these tests either. They're certainly taking them under consideration. So I think we in Scotland need to make the best decisions for us and for our population's health. My own preference would be a degree of caution until we get through the winter. We don't know yet what the winter is going to throw up. I know that the flu vaccination programme has started to roll out, but again, the uptake on that will be quite important. So I'm reasonably comfortable about this. What I am less comfortable about is Edinburgh Airport's pronouncement and the public statement on it, which I think was a little bit incendiary, to say the least.
Can you just remind us what that was?
They basically said that, I don't have the full quote in front of me, Maggie, but they basically said that the decision by the Scottish Government not to suspend to to insist on CPR tests would ensure that travellers would travel from English Airport and Edinburgh.
Martin, do you think that there's a risk that people would do that? But my understanding is even if you travelled from an airport elsewhere in the UK, does that, I guess if you're not, as long as you're not then flying into Scotland, yeah, you would be able to avoid the testing. Is that right?
I think so. I mean, at the end of the day, that public health is a devolved issue. It always has been, even to devolution itself. Public health sat with the then Scotland office. So I find it a bit odd that people in the field, such as Edinburgh Airport, would be making those types of statements. They must recognise the full authority of an elected government to implement public health within the country, within the nation. And like Sheila, I think we need to err on the side of caution critically with COP26 coming in. And I have to think that, as again Sheila said, with thousands which will be in the city of Glasgow, who will be going across the west of Scotland, going through to the east to Edinburgh, we really need to make sure that we're cautious in the lead up to a winter which might bring profound pressure onto the National Health Service in Scotland. So I think a cautious approach is the right one.
I mean, obviously, throughout the whole of the last 18 months, there's been so much talk about this four nations approach, and the four nations have tried, where possible, to progress in step with each other. Obviously, there have been important variances. But really, do you think the Scottish Government should have made more of the differences that they were making and explaining to people why they were making these differences, and also letting the voting public understand the kind of controls that the UK government have put on the other nations by holding the purse strings for things, Martin? Because it feels to me that we haven't really made that case very strongly.
I think it's been difficult to make that case when, well, we're on Broadcasting Scotland today, and it's good to have a vocal voice kind of promoting a pro-independence approach. But when you look at the mainstream UK media, it's fine to hold a government to account, but they also really need to play their part in terms of taking on the public health message. So I've got to admit, I think the media in some sense really needs to step up to the plate in that. Just in terms of the four-nation approach, though, there's only one nation in the UK that wasn't really playing its part, and that was the government of Boris Johnson. When you have, at the beginning of the pandemic, you had Mark Drakeford, you had Nicola Sturgeon, and you had Arlene Foster, all singing from the same hymn sheet. I think that says a lot about the nations which were trying to work together cohesively in dealing with the profound impact of a global pandemic on the state. And the only person who wasn't playing along was Boris Johnson.
Sheila, there's nowhere more obvious of the media in Scotland having a go at the Scottish Government and a kicking at them, really, is there, around this issue, than the recent debacle over the ambulance service. So, yes, like all ambulance services across the UK, the ambulance service is under pressure in Scotland for a number of reasons. But the BBC in particular have been extremely energised over the fact that the army are being brought in to help with the ambulance service, as if this is some sign of a failure. But the fact remains, the army have been helping out with the ambulance service in at least half of the ambulance services in England for over a month. So what's your reading on this particular story?
I think that the presentation of this particular story is really just part of the ongoing BBC narrative to present Scotland bad. The Sunday show today, for example, on BBC Scotland, led off by very strongly about the crisis in the ambulance service, about all the failings, about examples, dreadful as they are, of people having to wait for a long time for an ambulance to come, and eventually summing up with, if this doesn't describe a crisis, what does? And then they moved on to an interview with the Tory MSP, Sandesh Gillam. And during the part of that interview, it was the first time they mentioned that the army had been helping out elsewhere in the UK. Now, if they really wanted to provide a balanced view, they would have started off by saying the army has been called throughout the UK over the past few weeks to support the ambulance service, but they didn't, because they wanted, in my view, to create this is a really terrible situation that's purely to do with the ambulance service in Scotland, and it's really designed, I think, to misdirect public opinion deliberately.
And Martin, what should the SNP government be doing to counter that?
Do you know, it's an interesting one. I would first of all say that it's really important in a liberal democracy to have an effective scrutiny of any government, whether it's your own party in government or anyone else. So you require scrutiny at all levels, whether it's in the media or from an effective opposition. But as Sheila, made clear, they also need to reflect on the reality that if the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party are having a go on, for example, this issue, their own government, as you were rightly saying, Maggie, is doing the exact same thing in Westminster. So I think they're in terms of the BBC will find that its viewing figures are not the greatest in Scotland, and a lot of people, frankly, no longer watch terrestrial television. So I think not necessarily what the Scottish government can do or the SNP, it's what citizens do in terms of going online, not watching the BBC, not watching even ITV or STV, but watching other online platforms, for example, like Broadcasting Scotland. So I think what we need to do is be vocal about it in terms of saying, actually, do you know what? It's not on, but at the end of the day, I think the viewers make their decision by switching the channel, frankly.
Yeah, it's interesting. STV figures for news have gone up considerably, and I'm not suggesting they're any more or less unionist or more or less reporting of the kind of status quo, but there does seem to be a bit of a shift. But it goes deeper than this particular story. So, what we see in Scotland as a kind of given is that BBC Scotland will be deliberately antagonistic towards the Scottish Government, while the BBC in London, Sheila, are really treating Boris Johnson's government with kid gloves. So where do you think that division is coming? Who's behind that, do you think?
I remember, Maggie, prior to the 2014 referendum, there was a video clip doing the rounds with Andrew Neil, basically briefing journalists in the BBC about how to handle the upcoming referendum and how to report on it. And it was basically saying, believe nothing that comes from the SNP. They don't tell the full story, and this is what you have to look at. So I believe that clearly within the BBC there would appear to be some sort of editorial preference to report things in this way. I notice also that Laura Kuenssberg has been coming under some flack on social media because she reported something that she was told about Dominic Raab being a senior lawyer without checking her facts, and that's not the first time that that's happened either. So I think there's also an element of taking what's been fed to them and reporting on that. I do wonder actually if sometimes Scottish stories are fed to, or Scottish stories, sorry, are fed to the to BBC from the Westminster Scottish office, and they take that as their cue as to where to go with things.
I think that definitely is the case. And I suspect, Sheila, that we'll see more of this as we move towards 2023 and the possibility of another referendum.
Yeah, Maggie, maybe just to add to that, I
Totally.
mean, I think, we also need to remember the new BBC chair has made substantial donations to the Conservative
Yeah.
Party. And if the BBC is to be seen to be impartial and to deliver impartial broadcasting, and, I think we need to be fair and say that they do remarkable works in other areas. But the fact that the government has appointed a major Tory donor to become its chair, I think should be setting alarm bells off, not just here in Scotland, but across the rest of the UK for effective journalism to hold any government to account.
Yeah. The SNP have this week predicted that the UK faces a perfect economic storm over the autumn and the winter, which will affect jobs and businesses, livelihoods, incomes. And it's down to a whole range of things: Tory cuts, price hikes in food and energy, food shortages, tax increases, and of course, Brexit. But it's all going to be fine, apparently, because the business secretary, the new business secretary, has told us to don't panic. Now, I'm not sure how confident or how comforting it is, rather, to have domestic economic policy based on Corporal Jones in Dad's army. I'm inclined, Martin, to think that Private Fraser's view that we're all doomed is closer to the mark. Would you agree?
I always have hope, and that's why I believe in the independence of Scotland as the hope for the future of our country and those who choose to live here. The UK Business Secretary is, I think, fooling nobody. Ian Blackford, I think, was correct this week to talk about the perfect storm of bad economic situation. In reality, you will find that your gas prices will be going up, your electricity will be going up, general utility costs. We're seeing the end of furlough. There's over 100,000 people in Scotland at this moment still on furlough. We're seeing, of course, the cut to universal credit, which has a profound impact across the length and breadth of Scotland. My own constituency going to be deeply impacted by that. We're seeing food costs go up. We're also seeing, of course, as you mentioned, Maggie, Brexit, which is now really kicking in, where you start to see empty shelves, the lack of drivers, and the UK government trying to get around that by making HGV driving licenses less safe than they have been. You don't need to pass a whole range of tests. So it is, and it will have a profound impact on all of us living across the length and breadth of Scotland. It's not a good situation to be in, and again, another reason why we need to be an independent country.
And how concerned are you, Sheila, about the developing energy crisis? So we know that there is a shortage of gas supply. We know that wholesale gas prices have leapt up, I think 70% in August. It's meant that some businesses have gone out of business. I mean, when media commentators start saying things like, will we be able to keep the lights on this Christmas? You think, hello, 1970s, we've been here before. Do you think this has got real potential to develop into an energy crisis in the coming months?
I think potentially it has. And I do remember 1974 all too well. I think a lot of the narrative currently around what's happening with the post-Brexit opportunities is quite worrying in reality. I think the energy crisis could be real. It could be quite costly for an awful lot of people. Particularly those on lower pay and those who perhaps are maybe coming off furlough or who are seeing their universal credit payments cut by £20. So I think there is real cause for worry about that. I think the UK government have a laissez-faire attitude to most of these things, and I believe that they think the market will sort itself out. More worrying for me, perhaps, Maggie, though, is that behind all of this, there are some key Brexit opportunities, is how they describe it. But one of the things that gives me extreme alarm is the offshore network coordination, which in fact will look at how offshore energy and more green energies will be networked in the future into something called an enduring regime for utilities. So I think the government is quite happy for some of these things to be going on, including going back to pounds and ounces and putting crown stamp on glasses, because it diverts away from some of the underlying things that I think will harm devolution considerably.
So you think it's a bit of a power grab then?
I think the power grab's already been taking place. I think there's more of it going on in the background, and whether the media is deliberately distracted by it, but certainly it will distract the population from it and the people who live here.
We were talking about the financial impact. It's estimated that typical households' energy budgets, Martin, could go up by £400 a year. That's a lot, especially if you're about to lose your £20 universal credit uplift, and we're all going to face an extra tax next year to pay for the English Health Service. And 80% of households in Scotland are connected to gas. So this has got real potential. But the other thing that I don't think people are understanding is that it isn't just gas. So one of the outputs of gas is CO2. And I must admit, I didn't know this myself, but I've been doing my homework this weekend. And CO2 is important for lots of reasons, not least it's important for certain businesses, a fertilising business, for slaughterhouses. It's how slaughterhouses humanely stun their animals. So the impact, there's a shortage of gas, there's a shortage of CO2. So the impact on agriculture, which you wouldn't necessarily make as a link if there's a shortage of gas, is potentially damaging. And also the impact on electricity, because over half of our power stations are fueled by gas. So where do you see this energy crisis going between now and the end of the year, Martin?
Well, when you represent a community like mine where the universal credit cut will have a profound impact, and that's not just someone who might not be in work at the moment, that will be for working families across not just Western Berkshire but the whole of Scotland, who will be told by the Secretary of State for Department of Work and Pensions the other day, you just need to go and work an extra couple of hours a week. these the impact on my constituents will be profound in terms of the rising cost, the ability to heat your home during the winter. We're trying to move to a more environmentally friendly environment, but we still have the reality that we're dealing with gas boilers in homes, gas central heating. If you're living in a house, it's not properly insulated, or it might be on the pipeline for getting properly insulated. You're living in a tenement with 4 kids, and you're doing how many washings a week. These are the practical things that will have a profound impact on, and that's the cost of life and the cost of living. And the UK government just don't seem to be taking it seriously, like so many other things. They're not taking seriously at all.
And also not appreciating that, that it affects parts of the country that have worse weather and worse winters, and clearly that's Scotland, and especially the further north that you go. We don't all enjoy the sort of balmy climes of the southeast of England. The other thing that is going to develop out of this, and you hinted at the markets, Sheila, and that the market will settle, and of course that's the Conservative view, let the markets lead. But there's an anticipation that of the current 70 providers of power in the UK, now I think 7 have already gone bust. There's an estimated that another 4 will go bust by the end of next week. But by the end of the year, that 70 providers could go down to 10. Now, the ones that will go to the wall are the smaller companies, and lots of them have been companies that have developed a kind of people's energy approach, which is people get money back. Now, the government have said anybody who has credit with these companies that go out of business will not lose that money. But the big players in energy provision, who'll be the ones left standing, are less likely to want to take that business model on. So that kind of mini revolution, if you like, in energy supply that we've been seeing, that a lot of people have signed up to, a lot of people in Scotland have signed up to, is going to be affected. So again, the big players, the big boys, will be fine, but the smaller companies are the ones that go to the wall. I'm wondering, is it too much of a stretch to suggest that this has actually been the plan all along? Or is that just the market finding its level?
I suspect that it's perhaps not been the long-term plan, but it's perhaps maybe the inevitable outcome, depending on the way that the smaller companies negotiated and procured their supplies at wholesale prices. So I have in my time, but on a much smaller scale, procured energy, and there are certain times of the year where you go out and you buy energy from the networks in advance and you agree the price. But it may well be that this price increase that seems to not just affect the UK, but seems to be a market price increase, will have had a disproportionate effect on any sort of wholesale pricing contracts that the smaller companies would have had with the larger ones, because there are only so many people that produce the gas and the electricity in the first place. So I do think there will be a significant contraction, and it's to the detriment of the general public. I think that perhaps there's lessons here for Ofgem to make sure that there are some protections in place, or at least some equitable trading terms between the wholesalers of gas and electricity and the providers in the retail market.
Yeah.
So we can look to that going future.
Well, let's hope that Ofgem take that on board. There's not much sign that they are thinking about that at the moment. I mean, we often say, and we've been saying for a while, what is going to make people suddenly wake up that actually Brexit has happened? And I think, Martin, I think the shortages in shops, people are really beginning to notice. I mean, you can't help. You go into a supermarket and the shelves are not quite bare, but we're fast getting to kind of, East Germany, 1970 levels, if you like. But also I think that combined with the possibility that there could be power cuts, you never know, or the fact that people are going to find it's a case of eat or heat. It's a choice between eating or heating, or maybe not able to do both. Now that is a tough lesson for people to learn. That is one heck of a way for people to wake up to what's happening in the UK. And we need to make sure that the message is getting out there to people that these are problems that lie at the UK government's feet. Are you confident, Martin, that the SNP are able to take that on? Are you going to be making those cases constantly in Westminster?
Well, I would hope that it's been seen that we've been making that case since the referendum in 2016, if not even up into the lead up to it, and that what we were seeing in terms of Brexit and its impact on the peoples of Scotland has now come to fruition in many ways, very sadly, and will have a disproportionate impact on our communities. And, I think people are very alive to the impact of Brexit. And I don't think they needed to see empty shelves to recognise that. I think if we look at the last parliamentary election to our parliament in Holyrood, we've seen a substantial amount of people who are voting for political parties that regard being a member of the European Union as a good thing. So I think, and having, of course, a government between both the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Greens, a government which is pro-EU, I think the vast majority of my constituents, at least, are alive to this. It's not, something that they don't think is happening, and I would think that they recognise the only way to deal with that is to become an independent country. I mean, I have to say, having fought 3 general elections since 2015. They have resoundingly returned an SNP candidate, and I'm very grateful for that. And that reminds me that, constituencies like mine in Scotland, if you mirror them in England, voted fundamentally for Brexit. And that didn't happen in Scotland. I think our country is alive to the impact of Brexit, and it will be the fundamental decision which will convince so many more people to vote yes at the next referendum.
As we come out of the pandemic, and hopefully we are coming out of the pandemic, and there is light at the end of tunnels, and we can see the forest for the trees, etc., etc. Sheila, is it time that we kind of took the gloves off and started getting more political again? Because it feels that sometimes some of these bigger issues there's been a sense of we don't want to be too political. We've got this national crisis, we've got this international crisis, and we have to get our way through that. But actually, it's time for the gloves to come off. So I know that the First Minister wrote to Boris Johnson about the universal credit uplift being cancelled, specifically on behalf of the people of Scotland. Do you know if she's had any kind of response, officially or otherwise, to that?
The short answer to that is no. Sadly, I don't have direct communications with the First Minister. But I would agree with Martin about the constituents and the general population being quite aware and alert to all of these things. Certainly, when we were out campaigning at the Holyrood elections, people on the doorsteps were aware of these things, and they knew exactly where the blame lay, which is why I think we did get a resounding success at the Scottish elections. I do think the gloves need to come off a bit, and we need to be much stronger at making sure this message gets out, because it's very clear, also based on our previous conversation around the ambulance situation and the army being brought in, is that the media will not report any of this. They're saying there's a shortage of lorry drivers, there's some various things going on, but actually the root cause of all of this is Brexit. I came back from Ireland just over a month ago, and there's no empty shelves there. And nobody's wondering about not getting what they need for Christmas, unless they shop at Marks and Spencer's. So I think we need to show that this is not a global issue necessarily. It's very much specifically a UK issue because of Brexit.
All the more reason for independent broadcasters like Broadcasting Scotland.
Indeed, indeed.
So you've mentioned Ireland there, Sheila, and another big story that was developing this week was the fact that Michael Higgins, the Irish president, has declined to attend the religious service to be held later in October, marking 100 years of partition of the island of Ireland. He's come in for a lot of stick from the British press. They're saying it's a snub to Her Majesty the Queen, who will be attending. And he's taking the view that it's become politicised. The whole title of the event, the fact that it's celebrating partition, means it's inappropriate for him to go. And Sheila, he made the point that they even got his title wrong. They refer to him as the President of the Republic of Ireland, where of course he is in fact the Irish President. So is Michael Higgins right to say, I'm no going?
Well, in another short answer, yes, he is. I think he's absolutely right. It's absolutely at his discretion. The full title of the event is a service is marking the centenaries of the partition of Ireland and the foundation of Northern Ireland. And I don't think any president of Ireland could possibly go and mark the partition of Ireland. He is the president of Ireland as an entirety. I believe that he has public opinion behind him in Ireland, and but I think the whole thing has been politicised specifically by the DUP, who see this as an opportunity to malign the Dublin government. Conveniently forgetting that when Ireland had its own centenary celebrations in 2016, that Arlene Foster was very vocal, who was the then leader of the DUP, in refusing to attend and was actually much more derogatory. She could learn a lesson or two from Michael Higgins about statesmanship.
Indeed, Michael Higgins is actually, he didn't mention her by name, but he has said, he
No.
has pointed out that he has often travelled to the north of Ireland on state business. But as he said, the traffic coming the other way has been a bit scarce. He is also the first Irish president to have ever had a state visit to the United Kingdom. And he's absolutely crucial that he's not snubbing anybody. Martin, Sheila mentioned public opinion being behind him. I hadn't realised this, but Michael Higgins, when he was elected for the second time as President of Ireland, had the largest individual plebiscite of any politician in the history of Ireland. He had a landslide victory. So it would suggest that public opinion is with him. Do we know if any other politicians from the Republic are attending? Martin, do you know that?
I would say I don't know, but I think the Utrecht and Erin has made both the correct and only decision that the head of state of Ireland could ever make, being invited to an event which is about the partition of the island of Ireland. And I think they would have the full support of not just, the Irish nation, but, of the Dáil, of the Snád, and generally people would just, I think across the whole of the UK, would think it would be pretty bizarre for the Utrecht and Erin to attend an event such as this. And I'm not aware of any other members of the Dáil who would be attending that event either. I think everyone would assume that would be a bit odd.
Yeah, I mean, Sheila, it was meant to be a religious ceremony, but it has become politicised. No, not least, I think, because the Queen is planning to attend. Do you think the Queen should be going?
No. I don't think the Queen or the royal family have any place in Ireland anywhere. That's a personal opinion, not necessarily anybody else's, but that's my view of it. I think it's unfortunate the way the whole thing was worded, and I think it's been manufactured to look like a snub to the Queen, which it certainly is not. As far as I'm aware, other politicians in Ireland have not been invited, although they've been challenged about why didn't they advise the President, and they quite rightly pointed out that constitutionally it's not, they don't have that role in terms of advising the President whether or not he should go somewhere. So I think this whole debacle has been badly thought out. It's a ecumenical service among the main four churches of Northern Ireland, which I'm sure is well-meaning. And I know from my time living over there that they do work collaboratively across a whole range of areas. I just think that the way it has been presented in terms of its title has been extremely unfortunate, because anyone with an ounce of common sense would know that you couldn't expect the President of Ireland to come and commemorate the partition of Ireland.
And we know that Sinn Féin and SDLP are not going to attend either, and no particular surprise there. Sticking then with an Irish theme, obviously this weekend in Glasgow saw the resumption of orange walks. There were none last year because of the pandemic, and the traditional July marches were postponed because of restrictions at the time. But yesterday in Glasgow saw around 13,000 people march in over 30 orange walks across the city. The impact on the city was massive. Over 30 roads in the city centre were closed, and a number of people who have not particularly got any skin in this game have been asking the Glasgow City Council why residents should be kind of held up, if you like, and stop travelling around the city because of these marches, irrespective of what these marches are about. As usual, the Orange Lodge and the Orange Order have said that they are not sectarian, they're not anti-Catholic, and yet there have been arrests made for people singing racist and sectarian songs. Martin, is it time that all marches with a religious or sectarian background, including Republican marches, are stopped in Scotland?
Well, maybe the word sectarian I find sometimes a bit odd. Racism is racism and bigotry is bigotry. And singing bigoted and racist songs against people because they are either Irish or of Irish heritage, such as myself, think my name kind of gives that away, and or who happen to be Roman Catholic, and also specifically Irish and Roman Catholic, I think needs to be called out at every possibility, and not just in Glasgow. My own community, we saw an Orange Walk's been granted in Dumbarton, and we need to challenge, publicly anti-Irish racism and the bigotry against Irish Catholicism, specifically in the west of Scotland. The big issue for us, though, is about the issue of freedom of speech, which the Orange Lodge will use as their right to parade, and I can understand that, but that freedom comes with compromise under the rule of law. And that is that if you are singing racist songs and bigoted songs, I'm afraid you're not allowed. And, and that really needs to stop. It's against the law. And if you're breaking the law, you really shouldn't be out there marching, singing this kind of stuff. And we've seen it the last couple of weeks since I saw some of the activity in Glasgow. We saw a lot of youths all dressed in black marching under the Helaman's umbrella. And quite frankly, I was appalled by that. I just was dumbfounded by the response to it as someone of the grandchild of Irish migrants. And we just need to call it for what it is. It's bigotry and racism. And, don't confuse it. Call it what it is, and it needs to stop. The Orange Lodge needs to accept publicly that this happens at their marches, and they need to advise the rest of the nation, the majority of Scots who don't share their view, which is also a big positive. We really need to remember that they are a small minority, but a vocal one in our country. They do not speak for the nation of Scotland, and it's a nation which has really, I believe, moved on from this, but they need to call it out for what it is.
Sheila, as an Irish woman living in Scotland, how do you view the whole Orange Lodge and the Orange Marches thing?
Well, I was born and brought up in Scotland, but I am a child of Irish parents, so yes, I am an Irish citizen as of right, and I lived in Ireland. I think first of all, I really want to agree with Martin wholeheartedly about calling it what it is. It's absolutely white racism specifically against people of Irish origin or Irish descent, or even just Irish people. But I do know growing up, it was much more commonplace and acceptable. Then there used to be a large Orange Walk went through Perth on a regular basis, and people would turn out to see it, and it was a big spectacle. But in recent years, there's very, very few of them. There was one this year in August, and it raised a lot of public objections. So I think the public mood is shifting away from that type of orange unionism that is so destructive and so abhorrent. So I do think that there is a big change in the public mood, which is a good thing and to be welcomed. And I'm actually remember having a conversation some years ago about this, calling it bigotry and calling it white racism against Irish people specifically, and was told there's no such thing as white racism. And the fact now people now understand it is racist is to be welcomed. I think that there is an Orange Walk in Donegal though, every year in a small town in the south of Donegal, and it passes off perfectly peacefully. There's none of this venom or none of this anti-Catholic sentiment, and it is what it should probably be, which is an expression of heritage for members of the population who associate with that heritage, and it is not seen as anything other than it's a national parade or an annual parade, and it goes off quite peaceably, and there's not any huge to do about it at all. But the ones that are held here, and indeed in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, are an entirely different matter altogether. What I'd probably be quite interested in is how many of the 13,000 in Glasgow actually came from Glasgow.
Well, I guess we'll not get that breakdown, but we do know that in July, normally the Glasgow March is held a week before the big marches in Belfast, and that's so that people from Belfast can come over to swell the ranks here, and that people here can then go over to Belfast. So there may well have been people crossing the water, as it were. You were talking about people's freedoms, Martin, and freedom comes with responsibilities. Surely the thing about these marches that is particularly inflammatory is the routes that they take. Now, Glasgow City Council has a right to change the routes. They're hiding behind the police who said they didn't advise us to change the routes. But is there any need for these marches to walk past Catholic churches and to go through Catholic-dominated parts of the city?
No. It's antagonistic. And I think anybody can see that for what it is. And having been a councillor, both in Clydebank and in Glasgow, I know that it is a difficult decision in terms of how do you root somewhere, specifically if it's going to create profound problems in a large city like the city of Glasgow. But we need to start saying now, actually, do you know what? You're a very vocal, small minority who are antagonizing others within the city with one basic aim. You're not representative of the vast swathe of Scottish society. And if you want to do your march, fair enough. I know it's a democratic society, but you're not going to do it past whether it be a Roman Catholic church or another religious institution, because racism, whether it's targeted at Irish people, is still racism. Is, for example, if they're marching past a mosque or a temple, we need to be very clear that this sort of behaviour is just, no longer necessary. And the whole kind of thing, just kind of, I've always found since I was young quite bizarre. Going back to the actual Battle of Boyne, which is being commemorated, where it was, I actually believe it was Pope Alexander VIII who even sent troops to help William of Orange against King James. It's all very bizarre, the whole scenario, and I think its days are numbered in Scotland. It's not reflective of our nation. We have travelled so far, at least in the last 20 years of devolution. We are no longer the country we were, and I'm hopeful that with an independent Scotland, we'll probably see the end of this sort of open public racism against Irish Scots of Irish descent and also Irish people living here.
Yeah, I don't know why they can't just walk around a park, just not the park next to me. Thank you very much.
No, not to next to me either.
7 years ago today, I, like a lot of people, 45% of people in Scotland that voted, woke up feeling very, very sad because we hadn't won the independence referendum. How did you both feel 7 years ago today, Martin?
Well, do you know, I was overjoyed that Clydebank, Dumbarton and the Vale of Leven and West Dumbartonshire voted yes. And that gave me profound hope that the rest of the country would eventually follow not only our example, but that of Glasgow and Dundee and Lanarkshire, etc., who had voted yes. And to see our country have those 2 years leading up to the referendum, the huge discussions we had, which I thought were absolutely fantastic, no matter what side of the constitutional debate you were on, has invigorated our country. I think we are a vastly better nation for that discussion. And I think we are a more politically astute nation. No matter what part of the constitutional debate you take. So I was hopeful. I wasn't despondent at all. And, I've always believed in the right to self-determination, and that didn't change the day after the referendum. Democracy is an ever-evolving political process, and I know that the next time everyone else will recognise the value of independence, and they will see it for what it is, and they'll vote overwhelmingly for it. So my basic reply to it was hopeful for the future. We had learned so much.
Sheila, did you have the same Pollyanna-like response as Martin did?
Sadly not, Martin. I think I might need to move. Perth and Kinross, sadly, did not vote yes. They voted very much as the national vote turned out to be, in favour of remaining in the United Kingdom. I was frankly despondent, tired as well, but I was very despondent. However, as Martin says, just with a little bit of reflection in the days that followed, I realised that for many of the people who had become engaged in politics during that referendum campaign, particularly young people, and particularly people who had asked the questions and had decided to vote yes for independence, they were actually, they gave me strength in many ways, because they were determined that this wouldn't be the end of the story, and that we just needed to carry on and continue to make the case. And I think one of the fantastic things is that all of those people are still steadfast in their views, and that young people are still very much politically aware. I think our challenge is really, how do we engage with younger people effectively? They don't use the same social media platforms that I use, certainly, but nevertheless, they are politically aware. So I think that augurs well for the future. And if we think back to some of the commentary from or the discussion we had earlier on about BBC reporting, I think very few of those younger people in particular, that's not where they get their news. So I think that the immediate aftermath was awful, but in terms of the couple of days afterwards, but very quickly thereafter, you could clearly see that the people who had been campaigning were not going anywhere. And so which was very hopeful. And I think that this time round, we've learnt a lot, and we'll be able to that forward to the next referendum, hopefully next year or
Well,
the next
certainly
year or two.
the winner was democracy. The number of people who'd registered to vote was huge. The turnout was huge. I can remember being very excited during the day of the 18th when it was reported that several polling stations had closed early because 100% of people who were registered to vote in that polling station had turned up. Grassroots were key and absolutely crucial. The grassroots movement grew exponentially and was crucial because it got into places that, with no disrespect to either of you who are elected politicians, it got into places where politicians didn't. So the grassroots is key. So yesterday there was a day of action set up that was not a kind of official day of action. It wasn't sort of a day of action that the SNP government or the Greens had got behind. Were either of you involved in the day of action or know how it went in your area? And what do you think is the appropriate link between the grassroots movement and, if you like, the official campaign for independence, which at some point will be triggered, I guess, by Nicola Sturgeon? Martin.
Every day is a day of action. And, I wasn't participating in it yesterday, but, every day, for example, as a Scottish National Party member, a long-time member of the Clydebank branch, I know an effective local organisation is critical to campaigning activity, whether it's through a political party or through the other structures which were used during the referendum. And yeah, the grassroots element for me was a huge part of the debate and discussion. For example, in West Dunbartonshire, you saw people coming from traditional socialist left-wing backgrounds, trade union movement, former Labour councillors, etc., not necessarily joining the SNP, but setting up the Yes hubs across Clydebank, Dumbarton, the Vale of Leven, and they were essential in that campaign to making sure that people had the information they required and also being able to get out there and talk to everybody else in the community. So, every day needs to be a day of action, but the grassroots level really needs to be led locally. I'm not always convinced by big national plans of action coming in. I do believe that, I hate using the word, but localism is the key to the future of the country, and that will deliver independence. If it's making sense to you in a doorstep from somebody who comes from your community, giving that information, I think that's a far better way of doing it. And I think that was a big key part of why we won in West Dunbartonshire and in other communities.
Would you agree with that, Sheila?
I would actually, and at the time of IndyRef, I was neither an SNP member or a politician, so they came later. But yes, I totally agree. The grassroots work was fantastic. I really enjoyed doing it. I loved talking to people on a one-to-one basis and having conversations with a lot of women in particular who are worried about what the future might hold, and listening to all the propaganda. But once you're able to provide people in a more localized setting and in a more personalized way what the impact is for them and what the opportunities, more importantly, are for them, then, and given the tools to or the signposts to research for themselves, then I would say, most people who I spoke to certainly came back and were very much pro-independence and have remained so. I've seen an interesting Facebook post yesterday from, I can't remember which one of the Aberdeen Yes groups, but they said that the stall they had yesterday, they had a very interesting conversation with a young man who campaigned for no in 2014. And he came over, had a long conversation with them. And what he said to them was one of the reasons he approached the stall in the first place is that there was no big saltires and various other things. He came over out of curiosity to see what it was about and engaged in a very positive conversation. So I think that's maybe something we need to think about as well. And I also know that a friend of my niece's mentioned that she voted no because she felt there was too much in your face waving of flags. So perhaps there's some lessons we can learn from 2014 as well to help people who are sitting on the fence decide for a positive independent Scotland.
Well, we know that the unionist response will be to wave a flag. It will be to wave the union flag. They're doing it all over the place. And sadly, we're running out of time. We don't really have time to talk about the most recent imperialist move by the union, which, of course, is the announcement that we're going to have imperial measures back. It's all going to be feet and inches. Well, it is feet and inches already, to be honest, and pounds and ounces. But we've run out of time, sadly, to talk about that, although Sheila did mention it earlier in the programme. Thank you both for joining me today. It's a lot of things we've covered. We end the programme, as we always do, with a reminder to people that independent broadcasting is clearly crucial. We've talked about that all day today. We're seeing the battles we're having to face with the mainstream media. We don't have Tory party donors or billionaires giving us donations. We wouldn't mind as long as they weren't Tory. We'd like some more donations, thank you very much, because that's what keeps Broadcasting Scotland on the air. So please go to the website www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register and make a regular donation to keep us going. We have a tremendous setup here in Glasgow. We're desperate to get back on the road when it's a bit easier for us to do so. We have a brand new outside broadcasting unit, and we want to come and hear your stories where you are. But it takes money. So if you've enjoyed today, if you think there's a role for independent broadcasting in Scotland, and today has made, I think, that case very strongly, then you know what to do. Thank you for joining me. Have a very nice Sunday. Goodbye.